Make way! The High Priestess approaches.
The monster sat up in his prison cell, focusing on a slim figure coming down the stairs. In the room's single witch light, he could make out a few details. A black gown with a narrow skirt that flared over the stone floor, a spiked headdress, and a long, dark veil over her features. The orange pinpricks of his eyes narrowed. The guard stood at attention as the priestess approached the cell, her head high and her hands demurely folded.
Make haste, men,
barked the captain.
Secure the creature. Tighten those bonds.
She stopped just short of the bars as the guards made a show of pulling levers on either side of the cell, stretching the chains tighter on the monster's limbs.
How long has he been here?
3 days, my lady, but he has refused all his meals.
The priestess looked steadily at the captive monster.
Does he have a name?
He calls himself Sans, my lady.
The high priestess's headdress tilted to one side.
You know, Captain, wood and iron bars cannot hold a boss monster.
The men jumped as the monster snorted, as much as a skeleton could do so.
Funny, I told him the same thing,
he said, his voice rough and painfully loud in the tiny space. The captain gripped his sword hilt with one hand.
Silence, monster.
No, let him speak.
Sans grinned wider, baring huge, jagged teeth. Though he remained sitting, he towered over the humans on the other side of the bars, especially the young woman.
How generous of you, witch. Tell me, how may I repay your kindness? Let you take my soul? Harvest my magic? Or add me to your little evil collection?
The guards muttered to each other in dismay.
How dare you speak to her with such disrespect? She is the High Priestess of this realm, and you will address her as such.
Wow, what a loyal dog. You heard her? I get to talk.
He glared down at the priestess, ignoring the captain's sputtering.
Now, witch, tell me, what are you gonna do to me? I ain't very fond of surprises. My heart can't take it.
He placed his bony palm on his chest.
Grant me this one kindness, you magic thief.
The high priestess did not move.
Captain, free him.
Sans lifted the equivalent of an eyebrow as the men gasped.
High Priestess.
Release the bonds.
The captain swallowed.
Is this a wise...
Free him now.
The woman's hands dropped to her sides as the guards reluctantly pushed the levers back up.
Sans, I'd like to make you my apprentice,
she told the bemused skeleton.
In return, I will give you your freedom.
Stunned silence hung in the air.
You want me to be your apprentice?
He looked at her, and he threw his head back and roared with laughter. The captain bristled, moving in front of the woman with his sword drawn, then stepping back at her murmured command. The other men winced as the monster's laughter echoed off the walls.
How stars that is rich!
Sans slapped his thigh bone.
You know, I'd be less offended if you dragged me out and forced me to be your slave.
Suddenly, his grin had no humor in it. The priestess tensed as the monster reached up to grasp his collar.
Do you think I'm stupid? Me, as your apprentice, witch? Please, don't fool yourself with your own lies.
The collar shattered, crumbling to dust. He gave another laugh, eyes glowing a hellish orange.
But I guess I should thank you for the opportunity, 'cause now I'm going to kill you all!
The air around him exploded in white-hot flame. Power raced through the skeleton in scintillating waves, lighting the cell as bright as a hot day. Now Sans could do what he'd dreamed of since the first human sorcerer had caught him unawares, murder everyone in his path. There were so many possibilities. Fire was fun, but usually worked too fast. He could always tear them limb from limb, but that was messy and labor-intensive. Then there was blue magic, which turned them into stupid, flailing ragdolls, easy to pick up and impossible to put down. A twinge of suspicion interrupted his musings. Where was the screaming, or the sound of fleeing footsteps? Sans lowered his aura until he could see the room clearly, and what he saw chilled him to his very soul. His attack hadn't killed anyone. It hadn't even singed them. The cell's bars had disintegrated, But now a translucent golden haze stretched from floor to ceiling, and his magic was splashing off it like raindrops off an umbrella. The guardsmen were bravely huddled by the stairs, slack-jawed but unharmed, while the High Priestess stood right where she'd been, hands raised and lips moving. Sans was not quite so confident now. In fact, his first impulse was to run away screaming. This was the stuff a monster's nightmares were made of. He was trapped by a barrier. Once upon a time, he tormented his brother with stories about a bad little skeleton who went out alone after dark, or talked to strangers, or didn't do his big brother's chores for him, and it always ended with the bad skeleton getting caught by a human. All monsters heard those bedtime stories and learned that there was no escape from barriers. Not even the king was strong enough to break one, and just touching them would kill you. If you were lucky, the human would drag you off to be their slave, never to be seen again. And if you weren't, they'd squeeze the magic from your body or snap your ribs open to dig your soul out, then leave you to die and let your dust blow away. Panic closed over him like a shroud. He gathered all of his magic and threw himself into a shortcut out of the castle, only to strike an invisible wall and bounce right back into the cell. Shaking his head to clear it, Sans looked around and realized that the barrier had him boxed in on all sides. Anger saved him, as it always had. In another moment, he wasn't afraid anymore. He was furious at his captors and their whole cheating, thieving, murdering, thoroughly worthless race. And it was the worst possible moment for the priestess to open a small hole in the barrier and say,
Sans, please calm yourself. I don't want to hurt you.
She snapped the barrier shut half a second before a wickedly pointed bone thudded into it, the tip nearly touching her nose.
So be it,
the young woman said tightly, and the bone evaporated as the barrier glowed brighter. Sans knew better than to waste his energy in an all-out assault. Instead, the boss monster contemplated the force it'd take to punch through one small area around her neck or her heart. He might still be afraid, but every fiber of his being wanted that woman dead on the floor. So, with a flick of his wrist, he summoned an array of massive, razor-sharp bones, almost too many for the cell to hold, and began firing them at blinding speed, one after another. The priestess didn't react, but as he struck the same few inches of barrier over and over again, he saw bits of gold flake away, revealing a tiny crack. He smirked, focusing his magic to hit harder and faster. So much for the scary stories. Her people might have been glorifying her as some kind of mighty sorceress, but she was just another stupid human, witch or not. She'd raised her other hand to reinforce the spell, but more and more cracks were forming.
You're boned,
he thought, chuckling to himself. Still, as he watched and waited for the golden light to shatter, he had to feel some grudging admiration. Most of the magic-wielding humans he'd killed were big, blustery men, and none of them had lasted half as long as this scrawny female. What kind of soul did the witch have, anyway? He'd seen just about every color there was, and figured she was stubborn enough to be purple, or maybe a patient cyan, or even orange for bravery. After all, he was throwing out everything he had, and she wasn't backing down. The skeleton squinted at her through the barrier, searching for the telltale spark of, there it was. There it was. For the second time, Sans looked at her and knew instantly that he was boned. Despite the ferocity of his attacks, the cracks in the barrier were starting to fill themselves in, and the air crackled with another surge of her magic. A merry little chorus of rang in his head as he stared at her blazing red soul, and it only got louder when he remembered what that color meant. Determination. It didn't matter that she was just a human. His desire to kill her was nothing compared to her will to live. As the bones he conjured came slower and weaker, dissolving as they hit the barrier, Sans knew with horrible certainty that he wasn't going to win. The stories had to be true after all. Unless the priestess got careless and he could either kill her or use a shortcut, he was going to have to do whatever she wanted for as long as she said. But maybe if he caught her off guard. Sans let his arm drop. The last few bones clattered to the floor and he sank to his knees, head bowed. Behind the High Priestess, the men all breathed a sigh of relief. To her credit, the woman didn't let the spell go. She poked her head through for a better look at him, motioned to the guards to stay where they were, and knelt in front of the massive skeleton, halfway inside the barrier.
I'm not surprised that you wanted to escape. I can almost excuse you for trying.
Her voice was calm enough, and as far as he could tell with her veil on, her face was still expressionless. He would have bought it if he hadn't noticed her hands clenching in her lap.
Almost?
The skeleton asked, head still lowered, eyes fixed on her.
Almost.
He shrugged, watching her knuckles turn white.
I guess that's why you're the High Priestess, huh?
It is. None of my magic is stolen.
Of course not. Our power's no good in barriers. We ain't that stubborn, or that dumb.
My offer stands. Do you have any questions or conditions you'd like to propose?
Sans glanced at her headdress. The spikes atop it dipped in and out of the golden curtain as her head drooped. She had to have expended most of her power holding him off. After several days with no food or sleep, and then wasting all that effort on the barrier, he was pretty worn out himself. Too bad monsters couldn't take a human's magic. Just her soul. It took all his self-control not to jump to his feet in excitement. Why the hell hadn't he thought of that? An ordinary monster who absorbed an ordinary human soul was supposed to grow incredibly powerful. What would happen if a boss monster gained all the power of a gifted and highly determined witch? The High Priestess shook herself and sat up straighter.
Please answer me, Sans. I don't think either of us wants to go through that again.
No.
He admitted, shifting his weight back, edging toward the wall. Sure enough, she unconsciously moved closer, a few more inches into the cell.
I do have one question,
he said, moving back again. The woman frowned, scooting almost all the way out of the barrier.
What is it?
He slowly, delicately reached down and tapped on her headdress, gentle as a light breeze.
Mind if I get a better look at you?
The priestess started. For the first time, she seemed uncertain. She frowned, and as her mouth opened again, Sans lunged at her. There was no question of her ducking behind the barrier in time. Before she even knew that he'd moved, one of the skeleton's hands had closed around her torso and lifted her as easily as a child holding a doll. The barrier vanished behind her, and Sans said casually,
Heal, or I'll stomp her like a grape.
The guards froze in the act of drawing their swords. The priestess started to say something, but he flexed his hand ever so slightly, and she stopped. Sans smiled. He considered her for a moment, wondering if he should crush her anyway and squeeze her out slowly in front of the guardsmen, the way humans drained a monster's magic. It was tempting, and would be kind of poetic, but he decided he'd better not. He didn't want to damage her soul. Besides, she'd put up a hell of a fight. If anyone deserved a quick death, it was...
Sans.
To his astonishment, she worked her arm out over his fingers and rested her hand on his knuckle.
Please.
Normally, he would have laughed at a human begging him for mercy, but this didn't feel like begging. She was just looking at him, calmly. No, the crazy bitch wasn't asking. She was telling. She was distressed, but expectant, as if she was just waiting for him to put her down and apologize. He should have squished her or bashed her against the wall for that. But somehow, as the veiled priestess stared into the fire of his eye sockets, the idea of breaking her didn't seem much fun anymore. Her head lowered and tipped to one side, and all of a sudden it was like his mind, his memory, got pulled sideways. As he stared back at her, he was no longer facing a mortal enemy. He was back in a moment he thought he'd forgotten, standing in front of his house in Snowdon. A tiny human in a striped shirt was holding his hand and smiling up at him with perfect, stupid trust, and he knew that however much he despised humanity, he could never hate this kid, any more than he could reach up and stop the sun in its orbit. Why did he have to think of it now, when he needed all the homicidal energy he could muster? With a painful effort, Sans tore himself away from that memory, back to the present and the woman in his hand. The skeleton growled, starting under his breath and working up to a snarl that reverberated through the stone walls. To hell with her. To hell with all of them. Lack of space was a definite issue, but Sans prided himself on adaptability. He extended his arm to its full length, nearly shoving her into the frightened guards, which gave him enough room to materialize a single blaster. It was much smaller than usual, and that was fine, because it'd concentrate the last of his power into one good shot. The skull shone an incandescent red, eyes aflame and fangs glinting in its own light, literally nose to nose with the High Priestess. Sans let his rage and frustration rise like a tide of pure filth, distantly surprised that he could still feel some grief beneath it all, and the blaster's mouth creaked open from the pressure building in its throat. The priestess had pulled herself upright with her free arm. The scarlet luminescence was right up against her eyes, but she screwed them shut and leaned forward, face set with determination. In his haste to align the blast and hit all the humans at once, Sans didn't hear anything unusual. He didn't even notice when the light dimmed just a little, or that the pressure had stopped rising. But then a shock ran through him, like a hand grabbing his soul, and he jerked out of his concentration to see and feel the woman stroking the blaster's nose as if it were an overexcited puppy.
It's all right.
She said, so low that he barely heard her.
Please, stop. It'll be all right, I promise.
And he'd be damned if the giant skull wasn't closing its mouth and leaning into her hand. No one had actually touched one of his blasters before. They were long-distance weapons, and he used them as such, only getting close when it was fun or strategic to do so. His first reaction was horrified indignation. He might be about to vaporize her, but for crap's sake, he wasn't being inappropriate. As she kept petting, though, she leaned in and rested her forehead on the skull's lower jaw, and the skeleton felt an alien sensation steal over him, something he didn't recognize at first. The light dimmed further, the skull's jaws drifted shut. For the first time, Sans heard a soft, rich sound. It was the woman humming to herself, or to the blaster, as if trying to soothe it. And it was working. Sans felt as if he'd been drugged, with a sense of peace? Was that it? Yes, it was absolute peace washing over him, relaxing his grip so that the young woman had to catch herself before she fell out of it. She might have been smiling faintly beneath the veil, but he couldn't focus enough to tell. He wondered if it was the same magic that had made him think of Chris, a distraction to save herself and kill him before he attacked again. No, he wasn't drugged or under some kind of spell. Sans remembered feeling this way when he was a lot younger, and a couple times during the humans' last visit to the underground, when he and Pap discovered that at least one human was worth something. Of course, then they'd lost him, and there were no more humans worth anything. It never failed to amaze him. They'd had less than a month together, but all these years later he still missed the little bastard so much that it hurt. Luckily, the pain didn't last. The woman kept humming, and Sans grew less and less angry. The blaster made a kind of purring sound and vanished. At the same time, Sans' arm fell, releasing the priestess, allowing her guards to rush in and pull her away. The boss monster gazed at the angry humans with total detachment, scratching the back of his head as he yawned. She'd won.
You win.
Are you all right, my lady?
Demanded the captain, helping her sit down against the wall. The humming had stopped. The young woman rubbed her eyes, keeping them shut.
Don't kill him, please.
Was all she said. Sans closed his eyes, too. The humans were conferring in rapid whispers on what to do with him, but he didn't care anymore. It was almost a relief when they stepped back. A couple of them grunted with effort, and something crashed into his skull, knocking him out.